Well, good evening from sunny Matlock. We had so much sun that you couldn't actually see us earlier. We were just in silhouette, so we put some makeshift blinds up, but they kept tumbling down, and I think Gareth's just about on top of it now. Well, thank you very much for joining us in the evening, and we're going to talk to you about a project that we've just completed in Nottingham. And without dilly-dallying around, I'm going to try and share the screen now.
Down the bottom. I'll let you know when it comes through. Okay, yeah, we can see it. Brilliant. Take it away.
Great. So the project's now known as the DEC, and not the Disaster Emergency Commission, but the Dryden Enterprise Centre. And it's an initiative by Nottingham Trent University, recently completed. But our working relationship with Nottingham Trent University goes a long way back to 1997. And this was the very first project we did for the university, which was a modernisation and rationalisation of the amazing Waverley Building, the art school. So that was the start of a long journey in the city. A few years after that, we had the amazing opportunity to do the heart of campus in the suburbs on the Clifton campus. And following on from that, we then moved over to the rural campus at Brackenhurst and recently completed this new reception centre. So this photograph is literally hot off the Martins press. We're really excited about that one as well. And so having done the kind of rounds of the three campuses of NTU, it was wonderful then to, after that, be asked to look at another project back in the city again after all these years. And the genesis of the project is really in this slightly inauspicious building known as the Maudsley Building, which contains on the upper floor there a series of workspaces known as the Hive, as in hive of activity. Amazingly, we found out that the Maudsley Building was designed by Cecil Howitt's practice. And Cecil, of course, designed the Newton Building, the Council House, the YMCA, and so many notable buildings in Nottingham. And this one sort of slips under the radar somewhat. There's the interior of it. So you can see a sort of fairly conventional kind of open plan workspace. And the idea is that students from Nottingham University who want to set up in business get a helping hand, in the Hive. And it's a sort of nurturing sort of, what would you call it? Seed bed almost for new businesses to grow. Now, after many years of stumbling along with the Hive, the university decided that really they needed a bigger premises and something that was a bit more prestigious than the upper floor of Maudsley. And identified this site, which you can see on the right-hand side, which is a patch of grass left over really from the initial Dryden Building, which was the university library or the Polytechnic Library built in 1978. Rather a robust red brick building with rather nice sort of deep concrete reveals. Something of a background building really. We think it was designed by RMJM, Robert Matthew Johnson Marshall and Partners. One of their lesser known efforts, but pretty solid building. And it was always designed, I think, to be extended onto the grass area at the back. And there had been attempts in the past that had never quite taken off. So we still had that site available. You can just about see the red dot there on the historic map of Nottingham, and in common with many parts of inner city Nottingham, it was rows and rows of quite nice terrace houses that then fell into disrepair. And after the war, they were sort of demolished wholesale to create new, larger plots for the university in this area. One of the most remarkable things about this site, and some of you may know it if you've been up Dryden Street, is that it's cobbled. And we found that the cobbles were laid by Italian prisoners of war in Nottingham, and they were put to work and did this rather magnificent sort of Roman style fan cobbled layout, which you still see today. And then obviously to the right, that's our site, which is notable really because it's got some very beautiful plane trees in a row that you know make a room there, really make it almost an amphitheatre in that space. These are just some views looking around the site. That's down the old Shakespeare Villas, which is a footpath up to some housing association dwellings. And there's a view showing how strong the trees are when the leaves are out. So Franklin Ellis actually did a scheme for the site back in '95, and I think it might have gone as far as planning and then was halted. We're not quite sure why. But it's interesting to see that. We only found this out after we'd designed our building, but they too had introduced curves onto the corners. Quite a heavily glazed building of its time, really, but not, you know, in its form and general kind of creation of a space at the front of it, not dissimilar, you know, 25 years earlier to the kind of thinking we did. So as I say, it's a kind of collaborative workspace really, and a place for nurturing new businesses. So we did some research, and these are the kind of precedents we were looking at, where people can rent out desk space, and there's a kind of hub of new businesses, all learning from each other really. There's one called the Ingenuity Centre at the University of Nottingham that we visited and learned a bit from there as well. So at this point, Gareth's going to take over, and I'll move to the back, and Gareth will move towards the microphone.
So I guess one of the key things that sort of drove the design really was the site context and the site restraints. So this diagram just sort of shows some of those, as Robert spoke about. There's a whole row of plane trees that sat on the north end of the site, which somewhat sort of block out the views to the sort of housing estate behind the site. One of the other key elements of the site was there's essentially almost a story difference from the back of the site to the actual floor level of the Dryden building itself. So those were the sort of key things we sort of needed to contend with. So the initial brief for the project was to look at trying to get around 4,000 meters squared on the site. So we had a sort of look at how this could be done in a number of ways. And being a tight site and being quite constrained, one option essentially was to sort of fill the whole site, including where we now have our sort of entrance plaza, and then coming up a number of stories. But this kind of had quite an impact on the Dryden building itself. You ended up sort of blocking up windows, ventilation and light into the Dryden building itself. And then another option to get 4,000 meters squared onto the site was to look at a tower. And in some ways, we quite like this idea and the relationship to the Newton Tower that you can sort of just see there in the distance, and wondered how this might sort of bookend one end of the campus and the other. But again, being quite close to sort of residential to the north, it would have had quite an impact on its neighbours. And then there's a sort of halfway house scheme where we pull away from Dryden, still get the 4,000 square meters and come up. But in reality, 4,000 meters on the site was a tall order. And even the sort of 2,000 meters squared we did get on the site was quite tight and constrained. So this is sort of getting towards in the feasibility terms of the sort of how we ended up with the building we did. And what I quite like about this is it starts, you start noticing on the plan how the root protection zones of the trees and the lines of the trees start defining the actual form of the building and how it all comes together. So these are just some quick diagrams just to show all those elements. So yeah, the first one, the change in level across the site, which was yeah, a story, which was a challenge. It meant a lot of digging down to get the floor level with Dryden, to get that 2,000 meters squared. We've then got the root protection zones, which we're sort of squeezing into and around. As discussed before, we've got the existing windows from Dryden, so making sure we're not blocking light and ventilation, and reducing the quality of the building stock they've already got by building new stock. Another key factor in the building was the existing floor levels for Dryden. So one intent for the building and a possible future of the building may be that the two buildings are joined together. So one key element was to make sure that each of our levels tied into the existing building. So if they ever wanted to knock through and join the buildings together, they'd still be there. And then we've got Dryden to the south and some elements of south-facing glazing that we sort of looked at in terms of providing solar shading with the building itself and to get increased floor area. So you can see from the final image there with the footprint, you can sort of starting to see how the building sort of ducks and dives around the root protection zone, and then as we sort of come up the additional floors to get more area, we start cantilevering over those root protection zones. So you can start to see how the building sort of half designed itself, I guess. So this is the sort of site analysis which was shown before. So I mean the key concept, I guess, for the building was it started with a plinth. So the plinth is dug into the building. On one side, on the Sunken Garden side, it gives us our story entrance, and then we have sort of level. Essentially the first floor is then ground level at the back of the building, and then on top of that we sat a glass and concrete sort of piano nobile that raises to the sort of same level as the Dryden building, and then topping that was our brick penthouse offices. I mean, you can see from these sketches, and these are sort of like early pre-app sketches that we put together for the building, that initially we were looking at red brick. Nottingham is a red brick city, and I guess it's quite counterintuitive to do anything that isn't red brick if you're using brick. But I guess moving on from this stage, we started to sort of think about how it would tie in and work with the building and also sort of stand out. So just looking at the materials, I guess one of the key things for the building was it's a concrete frame. So the reasons behind this, and I mean, there's a big downside to concrete frames in terms of their embodied energy, but with it being an office block, one of the key things that we needed to focus on was more overheating. So we were keen to get a good thermal mass in the building to keep the building cool. We also had the issue of the floor levels for the existing Dryden building. So we're keen to make sure we got a good floor to ceiling ratio, because we're creating quite big spaces. So creating the shallowest floor depth was really key to making those spaces work. Thirdly, the site is extremely constrained. There wasn't really much room for anything else on the site apart from the building in the construction. The cabins were kind of round the corner in a little nook on Dryden, so they sort of sat on the site away from the site. So concrete there makes or an in situ concrete frame makes a lot of sense in terms of not needing the space to lay out materials. There's not the space to sort of lay out a timber frame structure or a steel beams even. And thirdly, creating the sort of curves that we started to look at. Concrete also sort of seems a good way of doing that. It's a lot harder to do in steel. It's a lot harder to do in timber. And sort of to counteract that, and we made sure that we're using sort of cement replacement within the construction. And then looking at the bricks and the concrete, the existing Dryden building has these deep concrete reveals in precast, something that we'd used before at the Clifton site and we were sort of keen to use again. And then looking at the brick, we were looking at something that was going to work well with the precast concrete, but also contrast with the Dryden building. And you can sort of see from some of the photos later, there's a sort of link between this and then the Newton building and how they all sit together. And again, this is the brick we'd used before. This is a funeral directors in Buxton, where, yeah, it's a Ipstop brick that we really liked and we're keen to use again. Worked successfully in our Clifton project with the precast elements. So these are sort of pre-planning sort of sketches and models, just sort of developing the idea of these cantilevering penthouse to create additional room within the building. And that sort of developed into more the angled shapes that you sort of see from the finished building, where we're making sure we're pulling away from the building, getting light into the existing Dryden building, while sort of getting the floor areas that were needed. So yeah, from this you can start to understand a bit more the sort of the root protection zones and how we're building up to them, how we're sort of building over them by cantilevering elements over them, and at the same time creating a sort of terrace on the entrance area. So while we're sort of keen to sort of sit within the existing context and take a lot of inspiration from sort of local vernacular, I guess there was some key historic buildings that have very much influenced this project. Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax Tower. I guess we started looking into this when we started looking at the tower option and how we could sort of tackle a tower on the site. And I think the idea of that sort of building sort of permeated its way through the design a little bit to the sort of the finished design. Yeah, sort of other example there is the sort of battleship, and then yeah, taking influence from all these elements. And again, had Shireen's house with the cantilevering panes, which were curved, and really gave a lot of inspiration to the angle balconies and the top penthouse. So these are just some of the planning visuals that we put together for the project. So I'll just fly through these. And yeah,
we call that one the centipede.
It looks like it's going to walk off any minute. And then from this, you can sort of start to see how the impact of the trees really do hide the building and put the building in, I don't know, a great context. And I mean, what's fantastic about that top floor and some of the floors against the building, it really feels like you're in the tree canopy. And then sort of trying to improve the walkthrough to, yeah, from Shakespeare's villas, and how, I guess one of the key elements I've not talked about is, I'll probably talk about the plan, so the fire escape. And then the elevations, just trying to sort of show how really using the context to drive where we're taking datum lines from, where we're sort of how we're sort of tying into the existing building, taking the roof line as our sort of solid datum, and then our lightweight penthouse that sat on top of that, not trying to protrude too far, too much further than the ridge line of the neighbouring houses. And then these were sort of concept plans. And I guess that one of the key elements of the building was the fire escape. We needed 2 fire escapes to the building. So we came up with the idea of using the existing staircase that was on Dryden, which freed up a significant amount of space from the plan. So we extended that up a couple of stories to be able to get to the penthouse. And the other key thing from this diagram, I think, is just to explain the setting out of the building. The red service core that sort of sits against Dryden is probably the sort of the darkest element of the building, where we're not getting natural light. So the natural place to really put the stairs, the toilets, the lift, the kitchens was to back up against Dryden in that corner. And as you can sort of see, the building sort of developed on its own in lots of ways. So just to run through sort of these diagrammatic plans, you come down into the Sunken Garden, you come through into the cafe reception area. There's a number of sort of meeting spaces that can be booked by the tenants of the building. And then moving up the building, the first floor, we've got a selection of office spaces, hot desking spaces, the terrace, as you can see there, and then just more open plan spaces, different office spaces. I mean, the idea is that these businesses can sort of grow with the building. Some company may sort of rent a desk space, then rent a sort of 2-person office, then a 3-person office, and the space within the building for those companies to sort of grow and develop. And then our penthouse, which is mainly made up of larger office spaces with some breakout spaces in the middle. I think one of the hardest and the key areas that the design was really the Sunken Garden. We had a fire escape from the existing Dryden building coming into the space, and to sort of come down at a level without it just being a whole Sunken Garden of ramps was quite a challenge. And to make that space a space that people could hang out in. I mean, it's a south-facing courtyard, although it's sort of quite overshaded by the Dryden Building. Yeah, so I think that sort of ended up being quite a key space to the whole building and the entrance to the building as a whole. So I'll hand over to John, who will talk through some of the sort of on-site construction elements of the project.
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, I'm going to do my best to just very briefly run through some of the kind of technical kind of intricacies. Yeah, one thing to note was, despite all the nice little sketches that Gareth's been kind of running through there, we actually developed this job as a BIM project, not a formally appointed BIM project, but we were fortunate enough to have quite a lot of the specialists and consultants on board, assist us with developing a pretty comprehensive BIM model. So we developed it working in kind of 3 dimensions, which was key for the overall design. Yeah, so this is just one of the kind of typical bay drawings. Yeah, so one of the sort of more striking bits of the design is the obviously the reinforced concrete frame. We've got a substantial cantilever, which was achieved with these. I think one of these cantilevers is up to 6 meters, and we had some. So you can sort of see pretty substantial upstand beams, which we tried to kind of cleverly conceal in the external wall and within the floor build-up, using a raised access floor system. But the building in general, I mean, some of the frame had to transfer some considerable loads, so there was some substantial contiguous piled walls, especially.
Has everybody else lost John there?
Yeah, we've all lost John. Should we carry on until he comes back?
Yeah, please do.
If your plugs come out, John, just we'll keep an eye on your microphone. So really that's just to show that on the top right there, the heat map, showing where all the forces are, and particularly obviously, as John says, around those kind of cantilevered areas and then going down through the core. McDonald's were the engineers, and you know, they did a great job integrating the massive cantilever structures, you know, seamlessly into the building. And then working in the BIM software, there was a lot of work, again, that's pretty much invisible in secondary steel work, supporting particularly the precast concrete elements of the building, that you'll see, you know, on the finished photographs.
Sorry about that. Just dropped connection there. Not quite sure what happened.
Pick up the baton again, John.
Yeah, just picking up from where we were there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this is a quite good image of the kind of coordinated model where we're looking at the SFS and the coordination in the SFS with the secondary steelwork and the precast elements that we had suspended off the slab edge. So there was a lot of sort of facade components to think about. And yeah, this is a good drawing, just explaining some of the intricacies of the masonry support system. So we had for the longer straight runs, the precast concrete string courses that Gareth sort of explained about, the datums. You know, we've established these very rigorous horizontal datums. The margin of error was really slim, so we had to kind of think about a clever way of designing in tolerance for the install, because you can imagine you've got a kind of slightly raggedy concrete frame. You know, as best a job as the guys can do on site, they're working. You know, they were working through the winter when they were casting some of this stuff. So the straight elements actually have a Halfon channel cast into the precast units, and then we have kind of horizontal tolerance built in with washers. You can sort of see on this diagram here, you've got the channel in the straight section, supported off the slab edge, and we needed to kind of, you know, the engineers had to think about pull-out cones for the slab edge because they were quite slender floor slabs. And for the radial elements, we actually designed in special support washers to give you that kind of three-dimensional tolerance when they come to installing, because the whole building was set out with a very rigorous brick module, and we were determined to get it as kind of accurate as possible to avoid any cut bricks, considering that we were using a set radial brick. That's what gives you those kind of very neat curved corners.
So there's metal elements there, John. We refer to those as the sky hooks.
The sky hooks, yeah, yeah.
It's Luckman no hands stuff, really. But we like to think there's a long and honourable lineage to this, because this is what the Romans did. Any of you have been to Rome, you know, with all the clever bracketry and clamps and cramps and all the clever stuff that they did to hang their stonework off the structure.
Yeah. I mean, despite the fact that a lot of the you know, the building has a real kind of effect of grounding. You know, we very much wanted to have a kind of relationship with the trees and the topography. I'd say the vast majority of the actual external facade is a clad element. So most of those huge kind of precast concrete elements are actually hanging off the floor plates. And then the design of the overall reinforced concrete frame was to kind of distribute that load as evenly as possible. And this is one of the trickier details where we had a corner junction with the main structural frame, and trying to figure out how you can clad that with you know, your kind of decorative architectural stone, and the bracketry involved with that. We had to kind of think about how they were going to stagger, how the curtain wall was going to interact, maintaining thermal continuity, all sorts of things, you know, right down to the accurate install of the internal timber linings. Yeah, I mean, there were several kind of just interesting junctions on the building. So we've got a kind of veil effect, expanded mesh cladding for the roof plant area. And there was quite a lot of kind of coordination involved, and you know, we'd sit, the beauty of it being built in 3D and using BIM software was that we could kind of really scrutinize these small junctions. And obviously during the kind of COVID lockdown, we spent, a lot of time with the site manager and some of the site guys looking at this in 3D and getting a really good understanding. I suppose one of the interesting points that Gareth alluded to earlier was the constraints of the site itself being a kind of tight city location. We had to really think about how we were actually going to phase the construction. And one clever bit of sequencing that kind of surfaced was the position of the crane. We actually used the stair core prior to the precast stair actually being installed as the kind of point for the crane to be installed. And here's just a bit of the early kind of sequence of construction. You can sort of see the slab and columns going in, and the pile cap wall to the north. This is sort of over the top. You can see on the larger picture on the right, you can see the upstand beam, which transfers a lot of that load for the cantilever. One thing to note actually, which you might not be able to pick up, but just above that row of columns on the left, we had to include small apertures, just kind of 150 millimeter diameter holes through the third floor and roof slab, which enabled the columns themselves to be installed. You can imagine you've got these huge concrete columns that are underslung, and they were literally threading them through the eye of a needle. Yeah. Yeah, that image is quite a good one to just demonstrate quite how how substantial that cantilever is. So all of that curtain walling is just floating up and disappearing above the slab edge there. And then we also included a nice little aperture in the roof slab to get the kind of feature roof light in the flexible space upstairs, the breakout space rather. Yeah.
So yeah, these are just some sort of finished photos of the project, and I guess this first one, I kind of quite like to emphasize the sort of the relationship between the new building and the existing Newton building, and how the rhythm and the scale of the apertures sort of sit in with the Newton building, and how the contrast between the Newton building and its stonework is sort of represented in what we're doing as well, sort of mirroring the two. And yeah, you can start to sort of see the mirrored soffits that start to come in the building, and I quite like this view where how our building starts to literally mirror the Dryden building and start to see what's on the other side, and you start to appreciate how the root protection zones have influenced the sort of the ins and outs of the building, where the terrace is sort of going over one, the building sort of tucks around another, and then comes in and comes out. I think the mirrored soffit was partly influenced by a trip to Marseille and Foster's Pavilion about 9 months before we designed this. So
we're all magpies.
Yeah, so just working our way through, and you can sort of see here how we're keen that the building sort of steps away slightly from Dryden and sort of creating a shadow gap with the mesh that rises to create the plant room and the external sort of air handling units, which are sort of hidden behind this mesh, how that comes to the ground and sort of grounds that and sort of provides a gap between that and the building, and gives and then there's sort of the terraced area for the ground floor, and then some final shots of that landscaping that I talked about earlier, just trying to create spaces that users of the building can spill out onto and other students can use. And again, the mirrored soffit and the terrace. And then there's just some internal shots. So this is of the cafe entrance area as you come into the building. the staircase, some of the second floor office space. So we're quite keen on the internal core to really sort of make it feel like a solid element. There's elements of solid concrete walls that we required for the structure, and where we didn't have solid concrete walls, we chose to use sort of fair-faced blockwork around the core to really sort of give that a solidity. And then these are some of the, this is the first floor opening onto the terrace. And then up on the top floor, and then the sort of the meeting spaces that sit within those floors, as well as the office spaces. And then this is our sort of penthouse level with the sort of ribbon windows that sort of go around the building. And I guess the idea with these ribbon windows is we ended up with we designed in sort of 450 deep mullions on the outer face of the windows to give us some sort of solar shading to the sort of east and west by providing some sort of vertical shading. You can sort of start to see here as they sort of turn the corner. And then our rooftop. And I'll leave you to talk about the book, Robert.
It's not in the book, but if you want to read about some other projects, they're in our book, on our website. They are book plug over. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Robert. That's fantastic. It's great to have another talk on one of your schemes. What was the procurement route, actually? Was it traditional? Was it design and build?
It was a design and build project.
That's really high quality for a design and build, I must say. Was there many? I suppose whenever you do design and build, you always think of those wins that you never got. Was there many that you didn't get on this?
Well, no, but it's a very good question. But we had done a number of projects with design and builds, also with the university, and the approach we take is to draw it pretty much to the same level that we would do if it was a traditional contract.
Yeah.
So there's very little room for maneuver, and the idea is to try and find the areas where the contractor can make a great contribution in terms of buildability.
Yeah.
To leave those for further discussion, but where something's very important, to make sure it's absolutely nailed down in the drawings and specification. So a prime example of that, for instance, is the curved bricks that John was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And we made a point of making absolutely crystal clear that these were bricks that were to be cast with curvature on them. We made sure with Ibstock that they were all available, and could be done in that particular Berkeley Old English brick. And so it went into the spec, absolutely crystal clear. But of course, the contractor, when it came to ordering the bricks, rang us up and said, "Oh, can you see way clear to omitting these curved bricks? You can always do them with headers. We've done some wonderful work recently using headers to the same radius, and they look fabulous." And of course, then you're under pressure, aren't you? Because you're working for the contractor, and there are these pressure points, and that was an absolutely classic one. And essentially, we just said no. It's there. It's got to be curved brick. Fortunately, they didn't start to try and persuade us away from the curved glass, for faceted glass. So there was a rule: no facets, only curves. So it was curved concrete, curved glass, curved aluminium, and curved bricks. And after a little bit of resistance, and I think even now, if the contractor was here, he might even be part of this group. I'd like to think he agrees that it was the right call.
Can you share what the actual contract value was at all?
Do you know? I can't remember offhand.
It was about 6 million.
Okay.
In that kind of order. Yeah.
And I suppose just a bit of intel, really, because there might be people that have joined us this evening that may not have come across your practice, but you're not a very large practice, are you? And you deliver some really, really impressive projects. I think last time I counted when I spoke to Sean, because I worked with Sean at NTU as well, he was obviously a former employee of yours. I think you were like 9 or 10 people at that time around.
Yeah, well, thanks to COVID, we're a bit smaller now, Mick.
Oh yeah. Hopefully that, on good terms.
Yeah. Well, we try not to do too many projects at once, and you know, I think by and large we like being a smallish practice.
Yeah,
we can really focus all our energies on some wonderful big projects that we get asked to do from time to time.
Yeah, and the book will show that. Right, I'll hand over to Cinzia now because I've noticed the questions popped in the Q&A tab. Usually when we start asking questions, people start to filter them through, and I'm sure Josh, our president, is going to drop something in the chat. So Cinzia, over to you.
All right, thanks Robert and Gareth, and that was John. That was a fantastic presentation, brilliant building. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. He says, great project with respect to the context and function. Are you aware of the non-context through Hawkins Brown project for the art and design building? Did you look into taking on the project with a proposal?
Taking on the arts and design project, I think that is.
Yes, yes. I think this is a...
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, yes, we were aware of the project, if that's what the question is, and of course we'd have loved to have been asked to do that project. And I guess behind this is a question about scale, because obviously the new art and design building is pretty substantial, but on the other hand, it was a different brief. The university see that very much as a sort of, in inverted commas, gateway building. So it sort of makes a very strong statement looking from the city. The Dryden Building was rather sort of tucked away behind the existing campus buildings, and so sort of had to poke its nose out somewhat. It's how we think of it. It had to sort of wave out of the window. Here we are. And it's really doing a very different job, I think, to the art and design building.
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. Thank you. We have another question that is about the assembly rooms. So it's the question is a side question on the assembly rooms. With you leading the petition, are there any progression with that? And have you considered putting in a proposal to reuse this building?
How long have you got? Well, there are all sorts of bodies all over the country now bearing down on the assembly rooms, which is wonderful. It's become a national cause. Having said that, Robert Jenrick, who's the minister in charge, has refused to re-look at it. He's refused to call it in because he says that local authorities should have the power to make their own decisions. That was his kind of call on it, the line of least resistance. So at this moment, the 20th Century Society and various other pressure groups are campaigning and lobbying politicians both locally and nationally to rethink this decision. Unfortunately, there's time because there is a condition on the assembly room's approval, or demolition approval, that says that there has to be a suitable scheme to replace it. Now, to me, that gives some hope because that may take a long time to happen. And I think that overall, there's a general kind of waking up to the idea that reuse and retrofit fits much better into the sustainability agenda. And of course, Derby City Council declared a climate change emergency only a year or two ago. And being, as we are as architects, we remain optimistic that time will help us and that there'll be a rethink at some point. In terms of putting it to a reuse, there are all sorts of ideas out there. Many people have put forward many different ideas, and we've got ideas. But at the end of it, it needs to be a useful building, and there are many uses for it. So I think it's really a question of political will.
Oh yes, I think on this purpose, Josh, I think one question, he says, with the core against the existing building, how was the ventilation? I think that is for, how was the ventilation organized?
The ventilation for the building.
Yes.
So the ventilation was a mixed mode system. So we've got mechanical heat recovery. So there's a big AHU on the roof. So the whole building is mechanically ventilated, but there is an element in the summer for natural ventilation. So a lot of the windows open. And I mean, you can see from the photos that we've got sort of mullions at I think 800, which means that the windows can fully open. They're not sort of just cracked open a little bit. So yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. This is for Tony. Not sure whether I pronounced this well. Anyway,
it's
so,
Jason Beerton, Cinzia. I know him well.
Okay. I apologize for that. Thanks for sharing the process and congratulations on delivering a fantastic new building. The initial condition attached to the 1995 Frankelli scheme included details of the external enclosure, care to preserve the trees, no external pipeworks, no roof plant. Interesting, your design appeared to satisfy the major of condition. Great unconscious work. And then there is another question. I do have a minor technical question. There appears to be a significant amount of masonry support connected to the primary concrete frame. How did you mitigate thermal bridging in these instances?
Can you answer that, John?
Yeah, with the masonry support, we had a special kind of helping hand, or rather, like a top hat bracket. And then we used a thermal pack between that and the actual masonry support unit, which kind of varied depending on what condition we had along the building. And also the actual slab itself is quite deeply set within the build-up. So the SFS, which is filled with insulation itself, ends up being such that the concrete frame's well deep into the building. So any kind of latent thermal bridging gets reduced on top of the thermal separation.
And I think from the photos that we saw, that was on the overhang to the terrace where there's not actually a building inside. So I think
yeah, that might perhaps be where it's been identified. Yeah, that's right. It would be an external condition.
Obvious on that detail or the photo.
Great. Okay, we have another question, again from the same. I understand that Ntu Sustainability Strategy strives for a minimum of BREEAM Excellent. Please, could you expand on the strategy utilized for the project? Thank you.
So I think the building achieved BREEAM Excellent. I mean, in terms of, there's various sort of strategies for getting the points that were required. I mean, in terms of energy in the building, I mean, we've got sort of passive house levels of insulation. We've got reasonable air tightness. I mean, not down to passive house, but good air tightness. We've got, as I mentioned before, we've got a mechanical heat recovery system. I mean, there's various things. I mean, it makes it a little bit easier that it's on a city centre site. So in terms of transport, you do quite well. Little things like having post-collection at reception, it kind of adds to points. I think we did some I forgot what it's called now. Some analysis in terms of lifetime versus cost. I can't even think what it's called. Of some
whole life costing.
Yeah, so we did some whole life costings for some mechanical elements of the building.
I was going to say as well, Gareth, we had quite a substantial chunk of the points were coming from material efficiency. So it was kind of the actual the building itself, setting it out to kind of BS brick dimensions and eliminating waste, you know, a lot of exposed soffits and columns, which kind of reduce the overall requirement for kind of internal linings. And then things like the large expansions of glazing reduced the requirement for the base levels of lighting that we required. As
with any project, it's a case of kind of working through the BREEAM process, isn't it?
Yeah.
As you know, there's a whole host of categories, you know, that we need to address all of them in order to build up enough points to get excellent.
That's right.
You know, we all have to do this on a lot of big projects. So I'd say the thing that we're most pleased about is that it's a city centre building, but you know, you can open the windows and it's sort of naturally lit and naturally ventilated.
Thank you. Another question from Diana Pasek Atkinson, NTU Enterprise. Do you feel the constraint of the site, particularly the trees, made you go for a more statement, shiny, impactful building than if you had an easier site to play with?
I think the answer to that is actually no. A statement, shiny, impactful building was really part of the brief. As I say, we had a site that was rather tucked away, a little patch of green tucked around the back of the university campus. But it was a very important building because it's really the link between the university and industry in the city, you know, business and industry in the city. So to use the analogy I mentioned earlier, it had to sort of stick its head around the corner and wave at everyone and say, you know, we're here, from a rather sort of disadvantaged position, very unlike the new Art and Design building on Shakespeare Street. So we were highly conscious that it needed to have a very powerful front to it and a strong front door. And that was very much, you know, part of the brief. So if we'd have had an easier site, let's say without any trees, but it was still in this location, we would probably have taken a similar approach, although, you know, some of the things that influenced the shaping of it with the tree protection zones might have altered, but we would still, as part of our, you know, own desire plus the briefing, you know, been wanting to make a strong statement that it wasn't just an extension to the Dryden building, but it was a building in its own right, you know, with its own use, that makes that link between industry and the university.
Thank you. Another question by Chris Headley. He mentioned that you designed using BIM. So did all main design consultant provide BIM data for federation? And if so, how did it go? Was it difficult?
John?
That's yeah, it's always a good question to ask, whether it's difficult or not. I think we were fortunate in that we had the structural engineers signed up for the producing a BIM model, and then we also had the electrical outfit also produced a pretty comprehensive model. It was really just coordination of the remaining kind of elements, which were kind of mechanical, and then some of the detailed elements. So the precast units and the curtain walling were just kind of drafted in 2D, but there's still within the BIM software, you can still kind of amalgamate the two, and you know, you can kind of coordinate within using the BIM software as a platform to coordinate with all kinds of data. But yeah, it was definitely very, very useful. Difficult in answer to your question, definitely challenging, and it's always a learning curve as well, because there's never really a right or wrong way to do it. You just kind of progress it as best as you can, and everyone, I think the whole team were on board with it.
But I think, I mean, quite often John would model the 2D elements from subcontractors to ensure it coordinated in 3D with everything else. So there was a lot more work that we put into it, I think, than if it was an ideal situation and everyone was doing BIM. We were kind of doing a lot of BIM for other people, for our own coordination, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in-house. Yeah, just even to better understand the proposals coming from elsewhere. Yeah, no, you're right, Gareth. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Not sure this is a question. Anyway, David NC, the Mirror Soffit is a winning idea. I saw something like this in New York City by Jean Nouvel. Here it does weird things to one perception of your vertical colonnade, contrasting the curved cantilever, which is probably exactly what you wanted it to do.
Well, I'm going to step in there, David. When we originally, the earlier versions, the cantilevers were concrete. And I suppose it's a sort of old school modernist view of expressing structure. So it's made out of concrete, so it is concrete, which is a technical challenge in itself, you know, particularly from thermal bridging point of view. And then our wonderful design team hit on this idea of the Mirror Soffit. And I have to say, personally, I was extremely skeptical about it and thought, you know, it sort of messes with your head when we saw the visuals. But, you know, it was a bit of an experiment. And actually, we weren't aware of John Nouvel's work in New York. So for us, it was, you know, very much an experiment. But I have to hand it to my colleagues here. You know, I think it's magnificent. But it's going to be a matter of opinion. But it's certainly eye-catching.
I think there's something it does with the, if it wasn't such a cantilever, I think it wouldn't work so magically somehow. I think having the cantilever, it kind of just gives you a bit of a sort of confusion, which I think is the desired
I suppose also, you know, introduces an element of fun into the building, which is quite a severe sort of, you know, solid, you know, quite a kind of, dare I say, well-mannered building in a kind of modernist tradition, but it brings an element of fun to it. And it's been great seeing people sitting in the tables there, looking up, you know, at the at the soffit. And, you know, I think for its use, you know, for young businesses starting up, it actually adds something to the imagery, you know, of their workplace and, you know, to their sort of day-to-day life. You know, it's a brilliant idea.
I think anecdotally, I saw on Martine Hamilton's Knight's Instagram page, she got a photo of her and all the team on the deck, taken up, which was
the vertical mirror selfie.
Yeah. Obviously, Martine was going to do that one, wasn't she?
Yeah.
In fact, obviously, when you guys said, "Oh, we're having the photos done today," and I think I spoke to you guys the day before we booked this in, and I thought, I wonder if Martine's taking them, and then lo and behold, Instagram, Martine's taken them, and they look fantastic. So we always try and give Martine a shout out because she's helped us. She's a good supporter of the society as well. So if anyone ever needs any photographs taken, I'm sure Robert and the team can definitely vouch for Martine's work.
Absolutely. I think pretty much every photo you've seen of all the buildings Martine took, you know, going right back to the Waverley building in you know, the late 90s.
I did my degree in that building, so I never actually knew that it was one of your projects. So that was nice to know, actually. Well, thank you, Cinzia, for running the Q&A. I suppose just closing comments. I note that there was a mention of the Hawkins Brown scheme that was to go on the corner. Now, I did mention at the start that we've got Hawkins Brown coming in to do a talk on their Midland projects. Originally, we contacted them to do a talk on that building. Now, obviously, because I also work at NTU, I saw the circular email about that building when it came out within the architecture department, and there was some uproar. And I think I know who put that anonymous message in. It may have been Paul Collins. So if it is you, Paul, we'll have to have a catch up. But hopefully we can get Hawkins Brown in to talk about that, and we can kind of roast them. But also I did notice that they've done almost an identical scheme with Schmidt Hammer Larson at Bristol Uni, and you look at the building, and I'd say it's 90% the same. Now, whether that's intentional or not, I don't know, but we had a good laugh about it within the NDSA anyway. So you're smiling, so I assume you guys did too. Right, well, thank you very much for coming. I'll just pass you over to Josh, see if Josh has got any final comments or questions or anything, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. No, I don't have any further comments or questions. Other to say, thank you very much again from the NDSA for taking the time to present your work. It's much appreciated, as I'm sure everyone in the joining us tonight will echo. And again, just to leave us with leave you guys rather with a reminder to look out for our next set of events. They were mentioned at the beginning, and they will be across our social media channels and hopefully a newsletter as well, if we have the time. So we'll be taking June off, and we'll be back in July, hopefully with some weather, some decent weather, and maybe a pint or two if you know, circumstances permitting.
I think just to mention, Josh, actually, we've got a couple of potential site visits on the go. We've got Faulkner Browns to agree to doing as a tour of the Moorways scheme. So keep an eye out for that on Eventbrite. We may have limited numbers to have a tour around that, but I'm hoping we can get 10 to 15 people. And also the Museum of Making, which opened, I think, yesterday. We had a tour around that with Bauman Loynes and
yes, that was during the mid-construction, which was very, very interesting to go around, and particularly a week before it got flooded out through Derby. Yes, that was now complete. I believe it opened either last weekend or is certainly open for the upcoming half term. But we will be looking to get a tour around the completed scheme. Again, circumstances permitting, of course, but those are likely to be towards the autumn. Yeah,
and I think another thing to mention on that, when we did our original tour, the contract, the procurement route that they've taken on that project was I think it was the first project that's used it in the country, was the IPI route, which you may have read about in the journal. And also it's a bit of a what went well conversation as well as a finished tour. We want to know, you know, what was successful, what didn't work, you know, is this going to wipe away design and build? I suspect not, but it's interesting to hear how these things have worked. So yeah, we've got those on the periphery, so please keep an eye out for those.
Yeah, I think it just remains to say thank you very much to everyone again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us.